Welcome to Another Thing. I'm Larry Menti. As I'm sure you know, Donald Trump was elected president even though more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton. The reason? The Electoral College, an invention of our founding fathers that allots votes based on states. Because of the past election results, there is a growing chorus to do away with the Electoral College as archaic. Can that really happen? That's what we're going to delve into today, starting with Ellen Kaloje. Ellen.
Thank you, Larry. The Electoral College has been enshrined in our Constitution since 1787, so abolishing it would be an overwhelming challenge. 38 states would have to ratify a constitutional amendment, but some loud voices say it can and should be done.
Isn't that a constitutional amendment?
Requires a constitutional amendment.
That is some heavy lifting.
But all right, so it involves heavy lifting.
Right.
Let's lift heavy.
Let's lift heavy.
Let's do it.
Right.
You know?
Now, we got to do it.
Yeah.
Right after Donald Trump became the 45th president, after losing the popular vote by 3 million votes, we heard calls to abolish the Electoral College everywhere. California's Barbara Boxer introduced legislation the day after the election in the Senate.
The presidency is the only office in America where the candidate who wins the most votes can still lose the election.
And Congressman Charlie Rangel introduced a similar bill in the House.
I've been involved in every civil rights struggle, so naturally I am for one man, one vote.
This is the 5th time a candidate won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. John Quincy Adams in 1824, Rutherford B. Hayes in 1876, Benjamin Harrison in 1888, and most recently George W. Bush in 2000. Serious attempts have come pretty close in the past to make the winner of the popular vote the president. In 1934, a vote failed by just 2 votes in the Senate. In 1956, a proposal passed the House but died in the Senate. And in 1979, a vote in the Senate failed by a 51-48 vote. So could there actually be a chance the Electoral College could become a thing of the past?
It's a dead issue. It will disappear once again. The only thing that would stop it would be if the same thing happened in 2020, if you had another blowout like this. But otherwise, no.
Graham Lee taught political science at St. Joseph's University for almost 50 years. He says there's another movement gaining speed in 10 states. It's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact.
And so what they've done is agree that regardless of how the voters of California or New York vote, if nationally one candidate gets the largest number of votes, over 40%, they will cast their Electoral College votes for that person.
He thinks that's a cute idea that will never get enough Republican states on board to really change anything. Meantime, some high-profile Trump supporters argue all this is just partisan nonsense.
We have a country based on 50 republics. We don't have a direct democracy. If you have a problem with that, change it, but don't change it after an election just because you're being a sore loser and you're upset that your person didn't win.
MoveOn.org has a formal petition on its website calling to abolish the Electoral College. So far, they have about 600,000 signatures, but it obviously will take a lot more than that to make abolishing the Electoral College a reality. Reporting for Another Thing, I'm Ellen Kaloje.
All right, thank you, Ellen. And now to talk more about the Electoral College and whether we should have an Electoral College is Joe Patten, the Associate Professor of Political Science at Monmouth University. Welcome back. Thank you so much.
Larry, great to be here.
It seems like this debate only happens when one side is upset in losing an election. Is that fair?
Yeah, the Electoral College has been controversial throughout American history. There have been about 500 attempts to change it, but it's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
But it seems like it comes up after, especially if somebody wins the popular vote and doesn't win the Electoral College, which has happened a handful of times.
Yeah, so there have been 58 presidential elections. 53 of them have been fine, and then about 5 of them have been called like misfire elections, meaning where the popular vote winner lost the election. Of course, it happened in 2016, 2000, 1888, 1876, and 1824.
Let's start from the beginning and then come to modern times and the chances of actually changing the system.
Yeah.
Why do we have an Electoral College?
Well, it's really for states' rights. And so one of the concerns was at the Constitutional Convention that the federal government might dominate over the states. So one of the things was, well, if the states are in control as to who serves in the federal government, then that would be less of a concern. So for instance, popular elections were not very popular with the American framers. The states were in control as to who was served in the Senate. The state legislatures appointed. The states were in control as to who the president was, and of course, judiciary was appointed too. So the only federal officials who were elected were people in the House of Representatives. And so that was really as a way to ensure that the states were maintain power and then weren't overcome by federal power.
Only because I know people are upset at your answer because I've dealt with them online.
Sure.
There are some people out there that are saying, no, that's not right. It had nothing to do with states' rights. It had nothing to do with any of this. This was all about slavery. And this was all about making a slave less than a man.
Well, that was the Three-Fifths Compromise, right, which was kind of like the low point at the Constitutional Convention, where the American founding fathers kind of said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person as a way to give more political power to the South.
But was the Electoral College about that at all?
Well, it is in a sense that the Electoral College votes is determined by the number of representatives and senators a state has. So therefore, if a state had 50,000 slaves, that would count as 30,000 people. And since at the time it was one representative for every 30,000 people, that would be another representative in Congress, and then therefore another electoral vote.
And it seems to me that all these arguments about why we have the Electoral College, you can say in a blanket statement, yes, you're all right. It all kind of played into it.
Right. It's where you sit as to it determines like where you're standing on this for sure. But at the time, like there actually wasn't a lot of debate at the Constitutional Convention of it. It actually was not that controversial. Hamilton said it's almost a perfect system. Jefferson later in the 1820s said no, it's actually a pretty bad system. And he of course felt the impact of it in the election of 1800. But today it's the Democrats in particular who are upset with the Electoral College because the Democratic Party tends to be on the short end of the stick in terms of winning the popular vote and losing the Electoral College.
Because they can win California, they can win New York, but Wyoming and many of the states, North Dakota and Utah, are Republican.
Right. So Hillary Clinton won by 2.8 million votes. She kind of ran up the score in California. She won by about 4.2 million. And so the way right now it helps the Republican Party is that it's kind of a rural-urban thing. If you did the math in terms of like how many electoral votes does a state get per population, then you would say a state like Wyoming gets one electoral vote per 160,000, whereas California, with 55 electoral votes, gets one electoral vote for about 700,000. So in that sense, an average person walking around Wyoming has about 4 times the political power in terms of the Electoral College than somebody from California.
And it was purposely done that way so that Wyoming would matter.
Well, the Senate was malapportioned, 2 senators per state as a way to protect the small states. Thomas Jefferson thought it was important to protect farmers because they feed us, and because he didn't want urban areas to dominate over the rural. And since rural areas tend to vote Republican, the malapportioned Senate, which links to the Electoral College, then benefits the Republican Party.
Before we get to the point where we can change this and see if it's possible to change, I do want to deal with one other argument you hear a lot, especially on social media, and the fact that why do people think we live in a democracy? This is not a democracy.
Well, the word democracy was not in the U.S. Constitution. We used the word republic, although our political system has become much more democratic over time. But yeah, and initially also the American president wasn't viewed as a representative of the people. Instead, that the American president was really viewed as an officer of the Constitution, and therefore it was less important that that person be selected by people.
So we aren't a democracy.
We are now. Yes. Well, we were a republic, which is kind of a representative democracy, which is a republic, which is, there's a lot of different definitions of
There's people that represent us that make the decisions based on our vote.
Correct. And so one of the interesting things is if you look at 2016, the entire Electoral College system was established so that an outsider, say like Donald Trump or from another political party, would not be able to secure the office. And that's why they very much wanted political elites or people who were in the know, who had a really good understanding as to the track record of these people, would be in the position to determine who the president would be. One of the things we've seen is that parties have grown a lot weaker. The political establishment has as we saw in 2016, virtually no power over the system. And so in that sense, if you know, that is kind of democracy, that people get to select their person in the political elites.
And probably social media has a lot to do with that, or at least the internet does, but that's a discussion for another time. Let me jump to the Electoral College now. The way of getting rid of the Electoral College is an onerous process.
Well, that would, you know, maybe require a constitutional amendment, which there have been 10,000 attempts to change the Constitution, and so there's only 27 amendments, 10 of them are in the Bill of Rights. One said you could drink, the other said, no, you can't drink, the other said go ahead. So there's really only 15 changes to it. So it's really difficult to imagine that the House and Senate would get 2/3 vote and then it go to the states at 3/4 to get a change. There is one way to bypass, to make changes without an Electoral College, and that's called an interstate compact. Right now there are 10 states which just on their own, through their state legislatures, who control this process, the Constitution says states control this, have kind of put through their state legislature a law that said that if whoever gets the national popular vote, that state will vote with those. And these are all very democratic, progressive states who, again, you know, almost...
We're upset about the election results.
Right. So there are 10 states who said that equals up to 165 electoral votes. You need 270. So it's not likely to happen, but technically there's no reason why states on their own can't agree and make their own law and say that our electoral votes will go to the person who wins the most popular votes.
It's very unlikely we're ever going to be able to hit the hurdles, jump over the hurdles to fix the Electoral College.
Well, for better or worse, the Electoral College is a uniquely American system. We didn't borrow it from Britain. We didn't kind of get it from any other philosopher. They got there in Philadelphia and just kind of figured it out as a political compromise. The one advantage, though, is that if you were looking for a reason to kind of argue for it, if there is corruption like we saw in 2000 in the Gore-Bush, and maybe if it's a close election, then you could at least kind of isolate a state and see like what's going on in that state. Whereas maybe if a national election, if it was just by popular vote and somebody lost by 100,000, you could have candidates kind of like trawling the nation, like looking for votes in every state. So in the one sense, it does kind of like isolate problems. But on the other hand, the critics of it argue it's undemocratic in the sense that the popular vote winner can lose.
But we're a republic. We just dealt with that. Joe, thank you so much. Joe Patten, Associate Professor of Political Science at Monmouth University. When we come back, a tragic new trend, committing suicide live on social media, when another thing continues.